Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and this is our benchmark of Call of Duty Black Ops 3, which is a fairly intensive single-player and multiplayer game, of course FPS, as you all know very well. So we benchmarked COD Black Ops 3 on various video cards. We had several configurations, more than 10 actually, and we also tested a few other things like memory consumption, sort of loose testing there, and VRAM consumption. So all of that is contained in the article linked in the description below, but we have some of it here, especially the core elements and a recap of the benchmark performance at 1080, 1440, and 4K using various settings within the game. There aren't too many settings in the game, and most of them are already understood or defined in our other guides, but the one setting to pay attention to here is Filmic SMAA, which is an anti-aliasing technology that applies temporally. So it's similar in concept in that way to something like NVIDIA's TXAA. With Filmic SMAA, the idea comes from Filmic, and that is to create a more cinematic gaming experience in the minds of those who implement Filmic SMAA. So what does it do? Well, it looks at the previous frames, the current frame, and other frames temporally. So it looks at everything around what you're currently processing, and it determines how the pixels should be filtered and how the anti-aliasing should be applied in the next frames. So this reduces the pixel marching effect you get sometimes in games, like with jagged edges and things of that nature, with movement and dynamic elements, and is something that is generally recommended on, but it does impact performance a bit. So we did some loose performance testing on Filmic SMAA before getting into our GPU benchmarks, because we didn't want to run our full suite of cards without understanding how it impacts performance. The findings are generally that Filmic SMAA creates a hit to performance of about 6.5%, so you get 6.5% lower frame rate on average. But with some cards, like the GTX 960, which is a lower end card, and other lower end cards, the performance hit grows, so it's more to the tune of 10 or 12% depending on your other settings and the resolution and things like that. We left this on for a lot of our tests, but we disabled it for some, and you will find that information in the article. But in general, any test that is marked extra, that's what Call of Duty calls ultra, is going to have SMAA enabled, except for in the case of the SLI configuration, because with Call of Duty, you actually can't enable some of the anti-aliasing technologies with SLI because it creates too much of a performance hit. So this is actually disabled in the game. It cannot be enabled through the game's menu. So we tested with and without it. Talking about test methodology for a bit before we jump into the benchmarks, Call of Duty has some unique challenges we face for benchmarking. In order to produce a trustworthy benchmark for this game, we had to spend several hours checking FPS, VRAM consumption, memory consumption, and stability in various regions of the game. We tested free running, which is a mode. We tested the first campaign level, multiplayer with and without players present, and the ready room, I'll call it. And we found that COD's single player and multiplayer performance metrics are separated by a vast delta, with single player outputting about 38.6% lower frame rate than multiplayer in some instances. We ultimately decided to run our benchmarks in a custom multiplayer course already uploaded to the channel, but shown again here, as we figure this is what most COD players are probably interested in. If you're into the single player, just subtract about 38% of the performance from these results to get your worst case expectation of single player FPS. That is what the first level puts you through. It's fairly intensive. What you've been looking at a little bit is the benchmark course. It's conducted on Redwood. This was a 30-second test run that was executed 3 times for parity on each card, and we found that the Redwood map provided some of the most intensive graphics elements in the game and decided to use that as our benchmark. You can find the full bench specs in the chart on the website if you're interested in the CPU, the RAM, and all of that. Let's get right into this. Once we moved to SLI testing at 4K, we observed severe frame drops that seemed uncharacteristic of the graphics hardware used for testing. To conduct further analysis, we ran resource monitoring tools, including Resmon, and checked system memory usage, and this is what we found. So you can see at the higher graphics settings at 4K, Black Ops 3 had committed 15.2 gigabytes of RAM out of our total 32 gigabyte capacity, and this was with a working set of 6.7 gigabytes. That 6.7 gigabytes working set accounts for the physical memory consumption without page fault, and the 15.2 number represents the virtual memory consumption or the pageable address space. And this isn't much better at other setting levels, but it is a bit better. We saw closer to 11 gigabytes commit size during some of our 1080p tests, and either way, it's clear that safety dictates an 8 gigabyte physical memory allowance for Black Ops, sort of at a minimum, and you might want more than that depending on your settings needs. We saw a full saturation of the GPU's on-card memory, also called VRAM, when running 4K and max on a 980 Ti. So that's 6 gigabytes of VRAM that was being tapped into actively for 4K at Ultra, and it was also utilized at the slightly lower resolution. So it is a fairly memory consumption happy game in that regard. Looking at Black Ops 3 at 4K and Extra, which is Call of Duty's Ultra equivalent, there's no surprise that 4K is intensive and effectively a fantasy to play. It's basically opting into multiple high-end GPUs just to be able to play 4K with Call of Duty's higher settings. So that's a $1,300 purchase for just getting the game up and running at a playable FPS with 4K. Lower settings would make it more doable, but it may just be better to dip to 1440p for this one. Check the article for more information on this. At 1440p, which is the heir apparent to 1080p, we saw that 1440p proves demanding enough that anything shy of a GTX 970 or R9 390, which is not present on these charts because we had to send it back, would require lower settings to meet 2560 by 1440 for the screen resolution. The R9 290X could achieve a higher frame rate with some tuning, like dropping settings down to medium, but it's not much use at 1440p and max. As for the test everyone cares about here, the 1080p Extra, which again equivalent to Ultra, benchmark is likely what most of you are seeking. Running Black Ops 3 at 1080p max settings, we see the SLI GTX 980 Ti is unsurprisingly leading by large margins, but keep in mind that you can't enable Filmic SMAA for the 980 Ti, so that is actually contributing to its performance gain. The 1% and 0.1% load times of the SLI configuration fronts a larger disparity against its average than other cards, but it brushes it aside with raw FPS output. Moving to more reasonable configurations, we see the single 980 Ti reference running at 133 average with tight low percent timings, and the R9 390X lags behind the GTX 980 non-Ti a little bit. Both cards are from MSI, but also remains a cheaper card by $70. The GTX 970 tags along behind the R9 390X, but struggles a little more with its 0.1% low FPS. And notably for AMD, the R9 390X did present impressively tight timings on the 1% and 0.1% low metrics. It's not until you drop to GTX 950 or thereabouts that the FPS falls below 60. Owners of the 950, the 270X, and the R7 370, which is not present on the bench, and the GTX 750 Ti will be forced to lower settings. Note that the 285 was removed from our 1080p bench as it encounters issues which produced unplayable frame rates, and we're researching the root cause of this in an attempt to determine whether it's a problem with Black Ops or the AMD driver, but for now we've just removed the 285 from the 1080p benchmark. Here's the chart showing medium settings with AA disabled if you own a lower end card, and you can find more information on this one on the website. That's all for our Call of Duty Black Ops 3 GPU benchmark. Check the website for more information, and we're going to be looking at this for other components as well, like the CPUs that we have and RAM. But overall, for GPU purposes, it looks like you're going to want somewhere in the range of a 960 or 380 if you're playing at more conservative settings. And if you're playing at higher settings, it's good, as always, to look toward the 970 and the R9 390, depending on how high you want to go with the settings. And you can check our charts as a reference for where you need to be there. And again, the article does make more conclusions on specific GPUs if you want to figure out more precisely what you should buy based on our recommendations. So as always, thanks for watching. Hit the Patreon link in the post-roll video if you want to support us making more content like this. Very time consuming, but it's a lot of fun. So that's all for the Black Ops 3 benchmark. I will see you all next time.